Hey. Welcome back to Kabbalah 101. Genesis in the 6 days of creation. Lots of hidden stuff that we don't know about. So sit tight. We're going to explore that in just a few moments. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 7 of Kabbalah 101, the science of Kabbalah. Today is Genesis in the 6 days of creation with Rav Yitzchak, formerly Ira Michelson. Welcome back, our dear Rabbi. How are you today?
Still. I'm still me.
Oh, still you. Yeah, still
Yeah.
not necessarily just formerly. Yeah, okay, good. Pardon me. Okay, cool. So let me turn my room speaker down.
Sorry for the late start, but we
Don't
have
let-
issues here. This is one of the issues you run into when you live in such a mystical place.
Well, the good news is the only people who's going to know we started late are the ones who actually log in live, and that's so
That's true.
the majority of them won't even know. So, hi guys, glad you joined us right on time. Okay, just kidding.
And with your new look,
Yeah, there you go. His much warmer setup at the
Sands.
point. Yeah. Oh yeah, got a nice little cut a few of his hairs on his head and on his pelt. And
well, I went back to a former look. If you look back some years, it's probably already like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. When I spoke at in Shari Tefillah in Toronto. I think was the last time I looked like this, probably.
well, you look a lot younger. You look thinner. You look leaner. You look like you're ready to go play some football.
Just cold, and I look colder. Yeah.
I'm not sure if that. Oh yeah, I
That's-
guess it does. Yeah, less hair, less bushiness. Yeah, I'm for sure telling you. All right, good deal. Okay, so real quickly, before we get going, and I'm going to say this at the beginning of every show, if you're tuning in for the first time, this ain't Madonna's Kabbalah. If you're really curious, or you already have critiques in mind on the negative comments you might want to put on here because you didn't watch episode 1, please go back and watch episode 1, and then you can come back in and comment. So right off the bat, there's a question on here, just a real quick. Old Time Radio. Oh, there you go, my man. How are you, bro? Ask Rabbi if he knows Michael Liatman, I guess that's how you say that, who teaches Kabbalah at cab.com or cob.com.
Michael Laitman. Michael Laitman.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Are you
Yeah,
familiar?
yeah.
So is that a trustworthy source?
Sure, I know. Look,
Dennis, good question, bro.
one of the reasons why I started the Kabbalah project and why I decided to teach now, specifically this subject of Kabbalah and focus most of my attention on it, is a result of teachings from places like the Kabbalah Center and B'nai Baruch, Rabbi Laitman. I have nothing, I will straight out say this. I have no problem saying this. It's not Lashon Hara because I believe in the importance of protecting both Jews and all the people from the nations that are looking to learn wisdom. The Kabbalah Center is not a source that you want to learn from. Of course, if you Google Kabbalah, of course they're going to come up very high because they're very well funded and been around a very long time, but they're not considered a legitimate source of teaching. They have perverted the teachings of Kabbalah and Rav Ashlag in a way that, especially here in Tzfat, I can tell you that most of us that teach this ancient wisdom are very upset with. As a matter of fact, they're attempting to reopen their center here that has remained a shell of a building for many, many years. And we understand, speaking of Madonna, that she's infused them with money again, and they're seeking to reopen. So we're praying against that happening. As far as Rav Laitman goes, he has some very, very good information. I will say that there are many people that are concerned at the direction that his organization is moving of late. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I would not say that what he's teaching is incorrect, but because he's probably, you're going to see, if you look at what he says and what I say, you're going to see somewhat the same. Although I tend to be today much more rooted and grounded in Judaism than some of the other people that are teaching this ancient wisdom. What I mean by that is that while I very much think that it's important to teach all nations Kabbalah, and I think it is one of the main sources of wisdom that is required for the coming of Mashiach and for redemption, you cannot divorce this wisdom from Judaism. You cannot turn it into a new age kind of philosophy to be a transformational new age worldview. It has to remain a very ancient Jewish wisdom that has its sources and its roots in the sages of Judaism and the great Kabbalists like, the Ari HaKadosh and the Ramchal and the Rabbi Chaim Vital and Rav Ashlag and so forth. So that's going to be my answer for that. And it is a very important question.
Gotcha.
But I do have great respect for Rabbi Laitman. So I want to make that clear as well, that I'm certainly not saying anything against him.
Sure. Fair enough. Okay. And just one final question, just to recap again, very briefly. What does the term Kabbalah mean?
The term Kabbalah means to receive.
To receive. There you go.
It comes from the root to receive. As a matter of fact, it's a word used in modern Hebrew as well. If you were going to, oftentimes you'll receive a receipt that's called a Kabbalah. Or if you go to, I've used the example of going to the hospital, for instance, and you walk in and the front desk is called Kabbalah, the reception desk. Or any place that you're going to go to where they would have a reception, it's called the Kabbalah. So it's to receive. It comes from to receive, and it's the idea of reception. And I call it the science of Kabbalah because I like in the English I like to call it the science of reception.
Nice.
This idea of learning the proper way to receive.
Interesting. Very good.
And understanding that, again, you can't reiterate enough and I was just talking earlier to my niece and nephew in America, and they are usually, we get into these very deep discussions, and I was trying to explain to them that while I try to tell them a nutshell version, and the listeners as well, nutshell explanations of these things, it's almost impossible to do at the same time. But when you're talking about this idea of reception or the science of reception, you're talking about receiving not for selfish reasons or in order to receive for your animalistic soul, or your nefesh, the soul that we have, which desires things, food, drink, sleep, and so forth. This science of reception is meant for us to receive in order to become more like the Creator. What do we mean by that? Is that the Creator only created this world, this universe, for good and to give good to his creation. If you believe that, and I certainly hope as believers, the people that are listening are believers and believe that, then you have to believe that in wanting to be more like the Creator and wanting to take on more of his nature, we have to transform ourselves from beings that receive selfishly for our own needs and become people that receive. And when I'm talking about receiving, and we'll get into this down the road, this idea of light, the light that comes down from Hashem, filtered through the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life in Kabbalah, it should be that we want to be vessels, pure vessels, and vessels that have been repaired so that we're not leaking light, that we're not leaky cisterns, so to speak, in order to receive that light only to give out. first transforming ourselves individually, and then allowing that light to go out to those around us, whether it's in our own homes or work environment and so forth, until we can see redemption come, or what we call tikkun olam, real tikkun olam, not this idea of social justice that you hear in some of the more liberal streams of Judaism today, but tikkun olam, which is a repairing of the vessels. I think we talked about this when we briefly covered the idea of shvarat kelim, the idea of the shattering of the vessels, and that holy sparks fell. And the regathering of those holy sparks is the true tikkun olam. So when we gather those holy sparks and we repair the vessels, that is perfection of the world, and what tikkun olam really means.
Nice, very good. Okay, so moving on to now, we're going to get into our kickoff to the beginning part of today's session, going to be on the 6 days of creation. And so I titled this thing kind of based on some things that I heard back in the old day. It has nothing to do with Bible codes, the way we know them, the research with algorithms and every other 15th letter. That's not what I'm talking about. But that actually triggered my mind into seeing, are there actually kind of things we can understand deeper by looking deeper into the words and the way the words are positioned, etc. Why does this word come first versus later, blah, 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 not just grammar. And so all this stuff these are things that Rav Yitzchak talks about on the show. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about Genesis.
So there's a lot of information packed into that very first chapter. Even in the very first verse, when we look at Genesis chapter 1, and the very first verse, the very famous verse that most people even know how to say in Hebrew, Reshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, this idea of, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The idea we can start with Breshit, that very first word, and the idea that it's almost difficult to go on from there, William, because it makes no sense grammatically when you bring up grammar. The idea that bereshit, that bet at the beginning of the word, is actually a construct. It's the bet that connotes the preposition in, and reshit, which is the Hebrew word for beginning. So it really is in beginning of something. The beginning of what? That's a big question that's been really, the commentators have pondered that question for the ages, from Rashi all the way down. And they say that the problem is that it doesn't make any sense grammatically. In the beginning of what? Why does it make no sense? Because reshit, that word beginning, is usually attached to a noun, meaning that if you look at other times in the Tanakh, when you see that word reshit, it's usually going to be attached to something. You're going to see reshit chachma, the beginning of wisdom, where we see. You're always going to see reshit attached to something, but it's not attached to anything there. It's reshit bara. Bara is a verb. It's not a noun. It's in beginning of and there's no of there. It's breshit bara, in beginning creation. So the sages have pondered this and come up with all different kinds of interpretations, saying that it's in the beginning of something, in the beginning of creating. Well, in the beginning of creating what? Rashi says that it could be in beginning of creating Israel, meaning that at the very beginning, our sages and the great rabbis quote from Proverbs chapter 8 in the later verses of chapter 8. The chapter 8 is considered the Chokhmah chapter, the chapter about wisdom, oftentimes used by our Christian friends that want to try to make it sound like it's talking about somebody else. Two things about that. Proverbs chapter 8, when it's talking about wisdom, uses the feminine, because chokhmah is a feminine word. So it's talking about wisdom in the feminine. So that kind of destroys one argument there. In the later verses, it describes this wisdom being by and beside Shem, the creator at the very beginning. And our sages teach us that what that's talking about is the Torah, that when the creator was creating this universe, when he was creating everything that we know of today, he looked into the Torah. That's what we're taught in Judaism, that he looked into the Torah, and it's through the Torah that he brought about creation. So, and that he had in his mind at the very beginning this idea of creating a nation, of creating Israel. That was Rashi's interpretation. There are many other interpretations about this.
So the script on the screen, it shows. This is a question from me to you.
Right.
I've noticed with nouns, when you have a tav at the end of a noun, it literally means of, like the letter tav, like in
Yes.
Bereshit, right?
Right.
But this isn't
Yes.
necessarily a noun unless you want to call that time, not because time
Right, but
time
it's
could
not,
be a noun.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that because it has the tav at the end that it's a it's on the tip of my tongue.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. It's a particular grammatical construct is I was trying to use to say what it's called. Anyway, but just because there's a tav in Reshit doesn't mean that it's necessarily speaking of as it relates to Reshit, because it's a noun related to beginning. There are other times when you see that where what you're saying is true, where when there's a tav at the end, it is a construct that it means of something.
And the reason why I asked
like for instance, I want to give you an example so you understand what I'm talking about. So, for instance, you were talking about Torah. Okay, Torah,
right.
we know, is the Torah.
Right.
If I say Torat Moshe, it's the Torah of Moshe. Okay, but so that's true. Torat Moshe becomes the Torah of Moshe by adding the taf to it. But you can have a noun that ends with a taf that's not necessarily a construct that makes it of. So you have to be careful.
Okay,
but
didn't we discuss this particular, the translation would make more sense by saying in the beginning of the creation?
Oh, there's no question. There's no question that all the sages of Judaism would agree with you. I'm just saying that you can't make the mistake of saying that
because of the way that spelling is.
Don't throw it out there that necessarily that because there's a taf that it automatically means of.
Got it. Okay, very good.
Okay, that's all I'm saying. We have to be careful that because people are listening, you don't want to have them assume that as you're learning Hebrew that they look at, oh, there's a taf there, so that must mean of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
So when we're talking about the beginning of Genesis, we've been talking quite a bit about the idea of light and time, and I think we need to go back into a discussion on time as it relates to this, because you talked about Genesis and the 6 days of creation, and we will talk about that a little bit today, and we'll probably get into it next week as well, because we'll talk more significantly about what it means when it talks about Yom Echad, one day, and then a second day and a third day and a fourth day and so forth, as it relates to creation. But we also have to discuss time as it relates to one of the great questions that people always ask, as it relates to the contradiction that exists between modern science and the Torah, and specifically Judaism, as it relates to the calculation of time for dating the universe. So, for instance, we know that in Judaism, we count that the Earth is just under 6,000 years old. But we know that modern science can pretty much prove, and I know that there are going to be contradictory voices in this saying that, for instance, that carbon dating is not reliable, but I can tell you for certain that modern science has come up with very, very intricate methods of testing and can prove that through fossil records and so forth, that even if they can't prove something being millions of years old, they can certainly prove something as 50,000 years old or 100,000 years old. So the big question related to time has to be, how is it that Judaism can say that the earth is just under 6,000 years old, but modern science says that the universe is 15 billion years old? And I was also discussing this with my niece and nephew earlier, with my wife. And my niece and my nephew looked at me like I was crazy when I said, how is it that the world can be both 6,000 years old and 15 billion years old all at the same time? And my nephew looked at me like his mouth dropped open, like, they call me by my English name, Ira, Uncle Ira. And he's like, Uncle Ira, what are you talking about? Like, how could that be? And I said, well, if you look at the first chapter of Genesis, there are clues and there are answers right there, but most people miss them because of language, because they're reading things in the English and they're not understanding the great differences between English and Hebrew. And most people are unaware that, for instance, if you were to look at modern science, and I'm going to digress here a little bit, and I don't remember if we've talked about this before, but one of the things that I find amazing is that if you think about one of the main concepts that is put forth by modern science today for the beginning of the universe, or when the universe began, you would be amazed, William, to find out that that concept called the Big Bang was only promoted from around 1970 by modern science. And most people look at me like I'm crazy when I say that. If you were to ask most modern physicists before the idea of the Big Bang theory came out in 1970, they would have told you that the universe was eternal, that the universe did not have a beginning. It just was there. It existed and was eternal. So it was only in the last 48 years that modern science came up with this idea of the universe having a beginning. And yet Ramban Nachmanides, who's one of the great Kabbalists, and his commentary is replete with Kabbalistic commentary, along with his regular commentary on the Torah. He was speaking about this concept of a beginning to the universe 700 or 800 years ago. So here you have one of the great sages of Judaism speaking about the beginning of the universe 700 or 800 years ago, and modern science and modern physicists only speaking about the beginning of the universe less than 50 years ago. So that in itself is an amazing concept. Now, when you start at the beginning, after the first verse, and the very next thing that we learn is that the earth was typically in English we read formless and void, tohu vavohu. Tohu, actually, I like the better translation would be chaos. That the world or the universe is described as starting from chaos. And the very next thing that we read about is the creation of light. Let there be light. And Hashem said, let there be light, and there was light. We might have touched on this a little bit, that people get confused. I know we talked about this on our radio show, which, by the way, people should remember to tune in to the Science of Kabbalah. That's on Israel News Talk Radio now, with me and my amazing co-host, William Hall of Tanakh Talk.
It's a lot of fun. You guys will like it.
Which airs, cool. Yeah, it is fun, which airs on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Israel time, and what is that, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I believe, which would be 9 a.m. Central Time. So anyway, we talk about that as well. A lot of the things we talk about on Tanakh Talk, we overlap in a radio show because we want to get this information out. It's not that I don't have a lot to say or a lot to talk about. There are other things, but I always believe that it's very important to reiterate these things because this wisdom is not always so easy to grasp. And so I hope that I'm putting it in a way as simple as possible so people can understand it. The other, what I was talking about is that people often get confused, William, as you know, with the creation of light and the sun and the moon, which we see only appearing later on in the verses, like in the third and fourth day, we see the coming of the sun and the moon, the celestial bodies being put up in the firmament. We touched on the idea briefly also on this concept of tzimtzum, this contraction, and the fact that Hashem had to take in a breath, that he had to contract of himself because the only thing that existed in the universe at the time was Hashem. He encompassed everything. He is the Ein Sof, without end. And so he contracted himself, and that allowed for darkness to exist. And within that darkness, Hashem then brought light, and that light filled the darkness. And then we see the establishment of other things from day to day. We already talked about Shverat Kelim, so I don't want to go into that too much. But I do want to talk about that in a later show.
Sure.
So I think what we should do is talk about this idea of how we can make sense of the difference in the times in those 6 days of creation. How do we see that according to Judaism and the sages of Judaism, who all the sages agree, by the way, that these 6 days were literal 24-hour days. They don't buy into this whole thing where people are trying to come up with this concept of, 1,000 years is as a day and a day is as 1,000 years, and trying to multiply it to come up with, some way of making sense of it, like trying to make Judaism fit into science. It should never be that way. And I hope people understand that while I talk not heavenly, while I talk heavily about science in this, I am not trying, like some people try to make Judaism fit into what science teaches. I'm trying to show instead that Judaism had the answers before science ever thought about these things. Like I just brought up the idea of Ramban speaking about these things 700 or 800 years ago, and the great physicists only coming up with the idea of a Big Bang theory, believing that there was a beginning maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So the two verses that I think that we need to focus on today to give that answer is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And before we get into those verses specifically, I just want to say, give you an example of like what Ramban said, or a couple of, there's a midrash on this from Parshat Bo in Shemot in Exodus 12. We just got into the book of Shemot this past Shabbat. And there's also some of what Ramban spoke about. Ramban brings about, actually, he quotes another one of the famous sages, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, who's usually just known as Ibn Ezra, who elucidates the text related to this concept of light being created when it says, "Let there be light," by saying that there existed nothing else, and the only thing that was created on the first day was light. I think we might have mentioned this, and because some people talk about what about the angels, for instance, and there are other commentaries that actually speak about the creation of the angels and says that they were created on the second day, and we accept this within Judaism because we would never accept or believe that anything or anyone participated in the creation of the universe other than the Creator. And Ramban also brings his own interpretation of the opening verses, and he speaks following. He says that the Creator created all creations from absolute nihility, meaning that he created everything from nothing. And then he goes on to say in his commentary that there is no word in the Holy Tongue, and this is a very important word because this is one of the words that we're going to deal with in verse 26 and 27. He said, there is no word in the Holy Tongue, meaning Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, that expresses the concept of bringing forth something out of nothing, except for the word bara. Bara, which is usually translated as create. He says the questions we have to ask ourselves is what, if anything, was used as a substance to create? If there was nothing new under the sun or above it, then what substance existed that could be used to create? We know that is noted that the world was in chaos or formless and void. So there was a need for something to receive form and emerge from the potential to the actual. And I don't want to go in too deeply in this, but he talked about a particular substance that he referred to as hu'uli, ul from Greek and hu'uli in Hebrew. And this is a substance that Ramban talked about that allowed the Creator to create or bring forth something from the potential to the actual. When we talk about verse 26 and 27, and then we see the distinction that's made between the words to make or to form and the word to create, we'll also see that there's a great distinction in the creation of the universe. Also in the book of Exodus, we see it being spoken about the world or the universe coming into being. It's used in opposite sequence. We'll see that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that first the word make or form is used, and in verse 27, the verb create is used. But then when we look, and that's related to the creation of man, but when we look later on in the creation of the universe, we see that a different sequence is used, that the universe is first created and then made, which sounds wacky, but it'll make sense soon, I hope.
Right. Well,
it
like you
makes
said,
sense to me. I hope.
Well, I mean, our conversation last week on create and make was pretty cool too. So I think people will get a lot out of that if they go back and watch our previous episode. I think it was episode 6. So.
Right. So again, we have to understand that these things are the same way I usually use the example of the difference between emunah and bitachon, that emunah, the Hebrew word for faith, and bitachon, the Hebrew word for trust, while having overlap and sounding similar in a way, they do have distinctions that separate them. And certainly while in English you could say that form and make and create seem similar, I think you used an example, and I don't know if we talked, I start to forget when we talked about these things, if we did it here on Tanakh Talk or if we did it on the radio.
That's hard to follow.
And we might have done it in both, but I think you brought up an analogy about the idea of you could, like I'm drinking tea right now instead of coffee today, but I can make a cup of tea. I have all the components for it. I have tea, and I have my tea ball, and I have honey, and I have hot water. I have all the components I need to make tea, but I can't create tea.
Right.
I'm not the one who created the tea, the loose tea. I didn't create that tea ball. I didn't create the honey, or the spoon that I used, or the cup that I'm using to drink it from, but I was able to make that cup of tea. And that's a big distinction. Right. So if we look at these two words, to form or make in verse 26, and maybe you have the verses in front of you.
I've got them up on screen.
I don't know if you are planning on putting them up or not.
Yeah, they're up on screen now.
And I don't know if you have them in the Hebrew or in the English there.
They're in the Hebrew.
Okay. So if you would, maybe, because do I have it in front of me? Yeah, I do. So if we look at verse 26, in the Hebrew, it says, Vayomer Elokim Naseh Adam B'Tzalmenu Kidmutenu we'll leave it at that.
Okay.
We'll leave it at Vayomer Elokim Naaseh Adam B'Tzalmenu Kidmutenu.
Okay.
And what does the English say in your version?
Okay. For Naaseh, for the whole thing. Let's see.
No, just what I just read. Those first that first part of the verse.
Okay, that was 25, right? God's
26.
No, yeah, 26. Sorry.
26.
And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likenesses." After
Right.
our likeness.
So Vayomer Elokim Naaseh. So that word Naaseh, when we see that word Naaseh, that word is from the Hebrew asa, to make, from the verb to make, Naaseh. So Vayomer Elokim Naaseh, it's saying, and Elohim or Elokim said, let us make, or let us form. Okay? Adam B'Tzalmenu Kidmutenu. Let us make Adam in our image, according to our likeness. Okay?
Okay.
But then when we look at verse 27, it says, Vayivra Elokim et Adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oto. That so it says Vayivra, and Elokim created the man or humankind, b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oto. In the image of Hashem, he created it. And then it says male and female, he created them. So we see Naaseh used in verse 26, Naaseh meaning to make or to form. And in verse 27, we see Vayivra, from that root bara. We see Vav, Yud, and then that three-letter root, Bet, Resh, Aleph, bara, to create. Now, like I said earlier, people will just assume sometimes when they see words in English that they feel express similar concepts, that they're the same. But when we're looking at these two words, they are so different. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the difference between to make and to create, and how does this relate to what we're talking about? So remember, we are discussing both science and Kabbalah here, and we're trying to make sense of how, on the one hand, science says that the world is billions of years old, while here, this rabbi in front of you and most of Judaism teaches that we're in 5778. You know, we're just under 6,000 years of creation. But when you understand those words, it's not that hard to understand. But before we give the answer, I want to go to what I talked about, to see that distinction in the creation of the heavens and the earth, where we see a difference. And that is in Exodus chapter 31. I believe it's in verse 16 and 17, where it says, the children of Israel are to keep the Shabbat, to make the Shabbat observance throughout their generations as a covenant for the ages. Between me and the children of Israel, a sign it is for the ages. For in 6 days, Yud Kei Vav Kei made the heavens and the earth, but on the seventh day, he caused and paused for breath. So what we see is that these verses are speaking about the Sabbath, an eternal covenant that the Creator made with his people. What we see, however, is once again a distinction between what we read in Genesis 1, because here in Exodus, we see that for instance, in Genesis, it states that God created, and in these verses, when he talks about the universe coming into existence, the word again that's used is asa, the Hebrew word for to make or made. Now, if you look at all of these, all of the times that the creation is spoken about in relation to the universe, what we'll see is the exact opposite. In other words, the creation of the universe came first, and then whatever, planets or so forth, were then made after. But man was first made and then created. So now we're going to get to the $64 billion answer. What is that? It's simply this. if you look at the Talmud, which is made up of the Mishnah and the Mishnah being the codification of the law, the laws of Judaism, and the Gemara being a commentary on the Mishnah, which is, people often, just to make the distinction so people understand that, I have to always assume that maybe we're hearing and somebody's listening for the first time and they don't really understand what the Talmud is, other than they think it's made up by men. And some rabbis came up with this idea of just writing something. The truth is that we accept the fact that the oral Torah was given to us at Sinai as well, along with the written Torah, because there are too many things that are left out. We're not given specific information. Like, for instance, we're told about kosher slaughter, but we're not given the details about it. We're told to keep this Shabbat, but we don't know what the specific details of keeping Shabbat are. That's just a couple of things. I can't imagine that Moshe Rabbeinu, when Moshe came down, that what we read in the Torah is all of the instructions that the Kohanim had, for instance, on how to minister in the temple. There had to be oral instructions that Moshe passed on to them that we don't see in writing in the Tanakh. So the Mishnah is the actual laws, and the Gemara are those commentaries. And while it may seem to the unlearned that it's just a bunch of rabbis arguing, there's a reason for that argumentation. I've spoken about this on this show and many other shows that I've done, that the argumentation that you see is meant to discuss that particular Mishnah, that particular law, from every facet and every angle, like you would a diamond, in order to come with the extremes on both sides of the argument, so that when we come up with an answer and say, this is what we're going to follow, it's because the sages have looked at that particular concept from every angle. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense to people. Right. So going back to this idea of the Talmud actually, believe it or not, William, brings us information that there were human-like creatures that walked the earth, that existed, that did not have a neshama, that did not have the elevated soul that we have, that they had a nefesh, they had an animalistic soul, the soul that desires to eat and to drink and to sleep and has all of those needs, but not that spiritual soul, that soul that connects us, that is related to the breath of life. We see in Genesis chapter 2, in the creation of man, further the creation of man, meaning that, and why I use the word creation, because it's the second verse, in verse 27, where we see create used, where I say the continuation of creation, we see that in Genesis chapter 2, I believe it's verse 7, where it says that Hashem blew the breath of life, Nishmat Chaim, into Adam, and he became a living soul, is what it says. Some translations will say a living being or whatever, but he became a living soul. What does that mean? That is the moment that Hashem blew breath into him, and that's the moment he became a soul, a living soul. So prior to that, based on what we read in the Talmud, there were human-like creatures that existed, meaning, and I know some people have spoken in the past about their potential for being a pre-Adamic race, and I'm not talking about the people that want to say the fallen, and it might be. We might be talking about the Nephilim and things like that, but I'm not going into that right now. It's just the idea that there were human-like creatures that didn't have a neshama. So now when we go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and Genesis 1:27, now we have the keys to understanding how Judaism can say that the world is less than 6,000 years old, and modern science can say the world is 15 billion years old. Why? Because in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, Hashem formed or made man. That is the time that we see that man that had not yet received a neshama had been formed or made. And then in verse 27, when he creates man, is when he blows the breath of life in him. Now, just because you see one verse after the other you don't assume that these things happened instantaneously at the snap of a finger. As a matter of fact, Ramban goes in, and many of the sages speak about this as well, that while they believe that we're talking about 6 actual 24-hour days, they say that all the ages of the universe fall into that 6 days of creation. Therefore, what we can argue here, based on the Kabbalah, what I've just taught you, is that from the beginning of Genesis 1, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, from that very first verse, into verse 26, when God formed man, that we had in that period of time those billions of years, and that the counting of from day one until 5778 only began the count from the day that Hashem blew the breath of life into Adam Harishon, into the first man. And that, my friend, is how Judaism can teach that the world is less than 6,000 years old, and science can believe that the world is 15 billion years old, and there can be no contradiction between the two. They both make sense, and they both can be 100% correct, both at the same time.
Interesting. That's good. It has to be explained somehow. Like you said, there's so many things that that I was unaware of that I actually criticize as well, specifically regarding oral Torah, things like that. And like you mentioned, there's things that it says do this, but it doesn't tell you how to do this. So it requires explanation, and for someone to say it doesn't, I don't understand your logic. So this is for me, this is very helpful. All of this is really helpful. So. Okay.
Right. I mean, I don't know how far you want to go. If you want to just stop there, and we'll continue next week.
Yeah, we probably should, because it's getting close to our.
Okay.
Well, not necessarily close to our hour. We got about 10 minutes left, but we're actually close to the time frame we need to start another show. So,
right.
Guys, don't forget to go onto YouTube, or you're already on YouTube. Just subscribe, turn on notifications, and then be sure to like the video if you enjoy this, and share these things with your friends. That's kind of how we get the word out. So, really appreciate you guys tuning in. Rabbi, I look forward to talking to you in just a few more minutes. So, always a pleasure. Thank you guys for tuning in. See you next week. Take care. Bye-bye. Shalom.
Hello.
חשוב מכל חשוב